Good morning, everyone. Okay, let's get started. We are hosting a kind of a follow-up webinar this week, frequently asked questions for office ergonomics. I did that as my monthly webinar last week and just had so many questions that we ran out of time in the hour. So I thought I'd do just a quick little follow-up webinar today. I don't think it'll take us the full hour. I'm basically going to go through more of the questions that you guys asked, either that were emailed to me ahead of time or since the last webinar, as well as some of the questions that were asked during the webinar that I wasn't able to get to. So, frequently asked questions for office ergonomics, part 2. My name is Sarah Snabel. I'll be the presenter today. I'm one of the co-owners of PROergonomics, just in case you haven't tuned into one of our webinars before. Just a little orientation, there is a chat bar along the side, so you can enter in questions for me, and I'll get a little notification when I see a question, so I'll try to address those as we go through, and then I'll also, if I don't get to it while I'm going through the webinar, I'll also make a point of addressing any questions at the end. So there'll be a little question period at the end. So make sure to use that chat bar if you do have any questions or comments. And I guess that's it. We'll get started. So really, the agenda for today is just answering more of your questions. So again, a follow-up a little bit to some of the questions that were answered or asked last week, just so I could include some slides with a few pictures and explanations. As well, some of the questions today tend to be a bit more geared about actually doing an assessment. So, things to look for, how to approach an assessment, not necessarily all about product here. And I'll dive right in. So this was a question that was asked last week, and I thought that I really wanted to follow up some more about this. So what do you think of number pads on keyboards? And so, I have a lot to say about number pads on keyboards. I think, for a lot of people, there's no problem with a standard keyboard, but then I think for a lot of other people, a standard keyboard, and I'm talking about the one where the number pad's on the left side and, where we position our mouse, it's mostly on the right side. For some people, that can cause some awkward shoulder postures, a little bit of reaching out to the side or some shoulder rotation out to the side. And you can see that in the picture on the left, right? So that's a good example. I will kind of say that I think maybe this picture is maybe a little exaggerated, but it gets the point across. Right now I've borrowed this picture from the Evoluent keyboard, Evoluent website, so they make the keyboard that's pictured on the right. So, I mean, obviously they could have some bias here because they're trying to promote their keyboard. But what you'll notice with that keyboard on the right is that the number pad is actually located on the left. And what it means is that the person is able to actually position their mouse a little bit closer to their body on the right side. So it really helps with shoulder postures. So if you're doing assessments either for yourself or for any of your staff, and you're noticing, they've got some shoulder discomfort, elbow, wrist, and you notice that they are reaching like this to use the mouse, because when you're centered with the keys, if you're a good typer and you're centered with the keys, your B is lined up, the B key is lined up with your belly button, then this picture on the left here with the white keyboard, that is very much what a posture could look like, especially if you don't have super wide shoulders. So this would be pretty typical. One solution is getting a keyboard with the number pad on the left side, or a number pad as a separate option, right? You can get keyboards that don't have number pads on them at all. You just want to make sure when you're doing this that the person is going to be okay with this, because some people who use the number pad heavily may not want the number pad on the left side. So you might want to look for some other options there. Maybe it's about moving the mouse to the left side, or, just talking with them about it. I find that people who do a lot of number entry, like data entry, I'm thinking like people in the finance department, for example, where they're dealing with a lot of numbers, most often I find that they are more willing to use the mouse on the left side than they are to use the number pad on the left side. So when you're trying to address those postures, just be conscientious about the person and the tasks that they do. So here's again just another example of a diagram. A lot of people try to line their equipment up kind of aesthetically. So when you've got your monitor and you line your keyboard and your mouse up perfectly centered with everything, what you'll end up doing is kind of twisting a little bit to the left as you're typing, and then you're reaching a little bit to the right for the mouse. And what we find with a lot of people is that they're really, if you're a good typer, which most people are these days, there's so much computer use, is that they'll actually shift their keyboard over so that they are centered with their keyboard, and it shifts the mouse kind of outside of this like central range with the monitor, and that's where we see more awkward shoulder postures or shoulder abduction, arm away from the body. And so a simple fix, like again, people need to be willing to learn, but is trying left-handed mousing, because you can see that if we try to still position ourselves centered aesthetically with our monitor, then we can get much better postures with our standard keyboard, right? So we can be centered with our keys, the B lined up with the belly button, and if we put the mouse on the left side, it's nice and close to our body, and it's kind of equal distance to the number pad on the right side. So this is something that you know, I've taught myself how to left-hand mouse, so I often flip between the right and the left side. I try to practice what I preach, but this is a kind of a good tip that if somebody is having some right shoulder issues, switching to the left side with their mouse can potentially give them some relief anyways. I was going to say solve their problems, but it might give them some relief, but they have to be willing to learn, because learning to mouse with the left hand is not necessarily easy. Forewarning. Some different keyboard options when we're talking about how to position the mouse in a different position. So the two at the top are probably one of the more common ones that I tend to recommend, just the Evoluent brand. They have a mouse-friendly keyboard, and they've kind of switched the name up on that a couple of times. So you might see it as like a left-handed keyboard or the mouse-friendly keyboard. But basically it's a standard keyboard flipped. So the number pad is on the left side, and really that's the only difference. The Evoluent compact keyboard, again, full-size keys, but no number pad at all. So that's really the difference. When you're looking for any of those compact keyboards, compact is kind of the word that is often used when it doesn't have a number pad, because it makes it smaller. But just be careful, because there are keyboards out there that are also called compact or mini, and they're kind of those ones that are designed to be plugged into your tablet or laptop for travel, but I find that the keys can be a lot smaller, and we're kind of creating a new problem there, right? The keys are a lot smaller, so now we're getting some awkward wrist postures to try to type on these tiny keys. So make sure if you're looking to replace your standard keyboard that you're looking for a keyboard that does have the regular or the full-size keys. Another one that's a relatively new keyboard is that Microsoft Sculpt Ergonomic desktop keyboard, and it comes as a bundle here. It comes with the keyboard in this angled wave type of shape with the built-in palm rest, and then comes with the number pad as well. So this way you're getting that compact keyboard and a number pad, but you have the option here to position the number pad on the right or the left side, right? So you can put the number pad on the left side, or you could put the number pad on the right side. You could switch it up based on what tasks you're doing. What I've also recommended for some people, if they really can't live without a number pad, but they don't want to do the number pad or the mouse on the left side if they're being resistive in that sense, is a keyboard like this option, for example. I would suggest putting the mouse in between the keyboard and the number pad. So kind of flipping the traditional placing of the keyboard, flipping the traditional placing of the number pad and the mouse, right? So that way then for your most frequently used item like the mouse, you use that more often than the number pad, then it is closer to the body and we are using better postures more of the time. Another keyboard is this Matthias Mini Quiet Pro. I've heard some really great feedback on this keyboard. Something that's a little bit different about this keyboard than the other three that are pictured is that it has the concave keys, which, I mean, most traditional keyboards do have that. So it's just kind of an interesting thing that when people are learning to use a new keyboard, what they might find with these other three keyboards is that the keys almost feel more slippery, just because they don't have that concave top to them. So the Matthias Mini Quiet Pro does have the concave, and it's supposed to be really quiet. I think it has mechanical switches, and I mean there's some extra reasoning as to why it's a little bit of a more expensive keyboard as well. So hey, if anybody has some contacts out there, I'm looking to get a trial of that one. I've heard some really good things about it from a supplier who, you know, has sold this keyboard several times, and it is a good quality keyboard. But if anybody has any contacts or any experience in using this, I'd love to hear some feedback on it. Another question, we get this a lot. You know, we got it more often probably a couple of years ago, and I don't get this question as often now, because now we're talking a lot about standing at work. And but is a stability ball or an exercise ball a suitable alternative to a chair? And there actually has been some research on this. I mean, and there's different amounts of research. Some are actual research studies done by a university group, and some are more studies or quote-unquote studies, but they might be done by like a physiotherapy type company or even the manufacturer of the ball. So you just want to be cautious about the studies or the information that you are reading. But in general, what I find with stability balls is that I wouldn't recommend them for the workplace. I know that people use them and there is some great success. You know, I think it's a little bit of anecdotal success, but ultimately what's happening here is that there's no back support here. So you're sitting upright and engaging your core muscles and your back muscles all day to kind of keep you in that upright position. So it really is like working out all day. And I think in the long run, it would actually fatigue some of your back and core muscles more. And that's what some of the more detailed or the university-based research studies kind of lead to, is that there's not really a significant improvement in muscle activity levels, or reduce in muscle activity levels. And the worry really is that it might lead to increased muscle fatigue, which would then put your muscles at risk, like your back at risk of an increased injury. As well, because the ball is a lot softer, it changes our hip angle. And so for some people, there might be some short-term benefits to that. But again, it's putting a lot of increased strain, or we're asking our muscles in our hips and our back and our stomach, our abdomen, to do a lot more work. So really what I do find is that when I talk to people who have used the ball, and they'll tell me, oh, it's great. Yeah, it's so much more comfortable than my old chair. And my question is always really, well, you know, what was your old chair? Like, did we really fix the problem here? Like, maybe your chair wasn't that great. Maybe there were some major flaws in the chair that they had, right? In terms of whether it fit them, whether it was adjustable, whether they were actually using the adjustments, whether they actually had a full ergonomic assessment to look at the whole workstation to see what the root cause was. So I think that a ball might be some temporary relief, but I'm always wondering then, you know, what was the problem in the first place? And again, everything in moderation. So, I mean, maybe a ball is good for some people, and if they're going to use it and their workplace has allowed them to have it, I just try to say, you know, everything in moderation. Try to make sure that, you know, like if you're going to use this at home, for example, everything in moderation. So if you're going to sit on the ball for 8 hours a day, like it's kind of like working out for 8 hours a day. So just keep that quote in mind. Since we're on the topic of chairs, I had a couple of questions more about specific features that a chair should have and whether or not there was a checklist available kind of based on the CSA guidelines. So at minimum, really your chair should have a height adjustable seat pan. So it should go up and down in height, and most chairs do that. Even when you buy like the cheapest of the cheap chairs, that's usually the one adjustment that it does have. And then you also want it to have some armrest adjustability in terms of height, or maybe even having no armrest, right? But fixed armrests are usually a problem because they really only are good for that quote-unquote average person, which, you know, doesn't exist. We are all different sizes, so we want to have some adjustability in the armrests as well as in the lumbar support or in the backrest. So whether that means that the lumbar support can go up and down, which is really the ideal, right? So that any kind of curvature in the cushion on the backrest, you want to be able to raise it up and down so that people of different heights, different sizes can get the lumbar support that they need. And then as well, we want to be conscientious that the seat is fitting the user in terms of how wide the seat is, because that's going to affect, again, how close the armrests are to them and just whether or not kind of their butt, their legs are actually fitting on the seat pan as well. Right? If it's too wide, then the armrests are way too far away from you, and if it's too narrow, then you kind of feel squished in a chair. And as well, the seat should fit in depth. So what that means is that when you are sitting all the way against the backrest, you should be able to lean against the backrest and not have the front edge of the seat digging into your knees, like the back of your knees, right, or your calves. So you don't necessarily have to have adjustability and seat depth in a chair, but it definitely makes for a better chair. If you're looking to standardize to one chair that's going to work for your whole office, then you're going to want to look for a chair that has as many adjustability features as possible, and that way then your one chair can be adjusted in so many ways to fit, you know, your 5-foot worker and your 6'2" worker. So some of those additional features that aren't necessarily a requirement, but are definitely really nice to have, would be being able to adjust the angle of the backrest so that, you know, some people like to sit super upright, some people like to sit a little bit more reclined. Usually what might come with that is the seat pan tilt actually. So if the seat pan can tilt, and you think, oh, I just want to sit flat, why would I want to adjust the seat pan in terms of the angle? Well, usually the seat pan tilt means that you can engage a bit of a rocking feature. So usually you can lock it in place, or you can also unlock it, I guess, and then what happens is you're able to rock in it a bit like a rocking chair. Great way to get movement into your seat for anybody who's doing, long phone conversations, reading. Other nice to have features is when the seat pan depth is adjustable, so you can slide it forward and back, much like the seat in your car or your vehicle. And then having the ability to adjust the armrests. It could be width, so they can slide in and out, or maybe even they pivot. That can be another nice adjustment feature. So those are all kind of like the minimum and the nice to have. And again, if you are looking at standardizing to one chair, like, for example, you just want to have the global tri-tech chair, great, that has a ton of adjustability features. Or if you're going to go with something a little different, you're going to go with what's an example? The Global has a Granada chair, for example, and I'm pretty sure actually that the seat pan depth isn't really a standard feature on that chair. It's an add-on, but if you're going to go with that chair for your entire workforce, it's probably worth it to get that extra adjustability to make sure we're fitting almost everybody. So how do we address sitting posture? So these questions I think are coming from more when we're doing an assessment. So what happens when we're noticing people who are sitting like this picture here? So maybe somebody who sits on one leg. What about people who sit cross-legged? Is this bad? So I got a couple questions related to this. Like, should we be telling people that they shouldn't sit cross-legged? And really, it is not really a great posture. When we sit cross-legged, whether it's like in the picture or with one leg over the other, what's happening is that you are creating some pressure points. You're reducing the ability for, blood to flow smoothly through all the muscles. So we are getting some reduced circulation. And again, it's creating some twisting postures. So when you sit, like even just sitting in your chair right now, if you cross one leg over the other, you can feel how it changes the muscles and the tension in your back. So it's creating some twisting and some kind of unbalanced postures in the back and the hips as well. Now, for a lot of people who sit cross-legged, it is habit. They probably don't even realize that they're doing it. But what I would suggest is that they try to become, or that you encourage them, is to try to become more conscientious of their posture. So maybe you're not going to be able to eliminate all of the times that they sit cross-legged, and maybe the person is just fidgety in nature, so they sit in a whole variety of postures, but we want to limit the amount of time that they spend in any of these awkward or bad postures, right? Movement really is the key thing to make sure that we're getting the blood flow. So again, gold standard is that we sit with our feet flat on the floor or a footrest, and that we're not sitting with crossed legs. But if we're trying to educate people when we're doing an assessment, we want to, explain to them some of the reasons why they shouldn't be sitting like that, and then try to encourage them to move. So if they're not going to be able to stop crossing their legs, if there's somebody who wears a skirt, for example, and that's just their habit, then we want to try to at least encourage them to get out of those bad postures as much as possible. Again, some questions that were coming in more about doing some assessments. So I had a question on how do I enforce what I've done? So when I go and do an assessment and I make changes to the employee, how do I then correct when I go back to do a follow-up where I'm walking by and I see that they've now changed things? So, they've lowered their monitor when I raised it. I told them not to cradle the phone with their neck and their shoulder, and they're doing that. I adjusted their chair and now they've put it back the way that I didn't adjust it. So, how do we make those adjustments stick? And I think, realistically, it's probably not going to stick for everybody, but you do want to make sure that you are providing the person you're doing the assessment for, so the employee, for example, making sure that you're giving them a bit of education, so understanding the reasons for the adjustments, as opposed to just coming in and being like, here, you need to do this, and just telling them what to do. You want to kind of explain, or maybe even ask some questions. Like when I do an assessment, I might see some red flags right off the bat. Like I might look and be like, oh, the monitor's way too high, or oh, I don't like the position of your keyboard. Why is it on that weird angle? But instead of making all of those adjustments or changes right away, I usually try to ask why things are set up that way. So, oh, I notice your monitor is at this height, why is that? And try to see what it is. Maybe there's a reason there. I mean, maybe it's not a good reason and we're going to make some changes anyways, but just understanding kind of why they've set things up the way they have. And then when you are going to make an adjustment, making sure that you are telling them why so they understand the reasons. I also try to get the person, the employee, to do the changes themselves. So instead of me adjusting the monitor, I will tell them, okay, the monitor should be, the top of the monitor should be in line with your eye height, and then I'll have them do it. Because I also find that if they know how to do the adjustments, then when I leave, they can make some tweaks, right? So they can, if they know how to adjust their equipment, it's not like they necessarily have to call me back every time they want to make an adjustment. So I try to tell them what that guideline is and why they need to make the adjustment, and then try to have them do it. And then I can help, right? I can provide some feedback. If you're noticing still that, adjustments are not being maintained, it's worth a follow-up to find out why the adjustments aren't being maintained. So maybe there's a really good reason. Maybe it's not just because they didn't want to listen to what you said, but maybe it's really not working for them and we need to look for another solution. It's not like we can just go out with our checklist, which is, often the case. We want to say, okay, well, we need to make you look like this diagram. And so therefore we need to adjust your monitor, blah, blah, blah. We're going to adjust your keyboard. But you want to make sure that, because maybe the adjustments didn't really work for them. Maybe they thought it was working okay when you were there doing the assessment, but when you left and they were actually doing work, they're like, oh, I'm not comfortable with that. So sometimes it's about doing a follow-up, because it could mean that, the first recommendation or the first adjustment we did wasn't quite right, and we need to look for another solution. Right? So looking for those alternatives. I had another question come in about how to conduct an assessment. So in this case, it was, how do I approach individuals who are of different statures? I want to avoid potentially awkward situations. How do I build that relationship with somebody to make sure that it isn't going to be awkward, or that they're actually going to listen to what I said? Because, it's a good point that, we are trying to set people up so that they're reducing their risk of injury, but we want to make sure that they're buying into what we're saying and that it is more of a collaborative approach. I mean, that's definitely the approach that I try to take. But when you're doing an assessment, I mean, really how you do an assessment and why or when you do an assessment ideally should be a standardized process. So if you are the person who is going out and doing assessments in your workplace, it is ideal if you have almost like a policy in place in terms of when you go out and do an assessment for somebody, right? So, or why you do an assessment. So if somebody brings in, maybe it's because somebody brings in a doctor's note. Maybe that's one of the reasons that automatically triggers an assessment. Or they have to come to Employee Health Center and request an ergonomic assessment, or they have to submit an online request. Whatever your process might be, I know it's a little different in every for the clients that we work with, it's a little bit different everywhere, but it should be a standardized process. And that way then, you're not just getting an assessment because, you have a doctor's note and you kind of whine and cry the most or the loudest, or you're not getting an assessment just because you're the tall person, right? Like, you want to make sure that it is a standardized process, and then you're eliminating any of that bias or potentially favoritism that others might see. And then ideally, you're also, when you're doing your assessments, you're standardized even in how you're doing it in terms of using a checklist. So I use a checklist. I don't necessarily bring that physical checklist with me all the time because I've done it enough times that I have it memorized, but I will always go through the same general process. So I start with an introduction. I start with, tell me about how you work, tell me about some of your challenges, tell me about your discomfort, and then I go through a standardized process of looking at the chair, then the keyboard and the mouse, and the height that they're at and how they're using them. And then I'll talk about the monitor, and then I'll talk about the phone, paperwork or documents that they might use, and then other is my other category. So it could be if they work on a laptop at home, or if they're traveling a lot, or whatever else it might be, right? Maybe they do a lot of filing and I'm talking about that stuff as well. But a standardized process then means that there is no difference between, whether you're doing an assessment for this person or that person, in this department or that department, this size is that size. You're doing the same process every time. And really you're trying to find out the specific challenges. Again, a lot of people have asked, what's the best keyboard that I could recommend, or what's the best chair, and best is really a tough word, because there's a best chair, or there's a good chair, a decent chair for each individual scenario. So again, I showed you some of those keyboards, and I think that they're all great keyboards, but they all have a place. So it's important to make sure that you really are figuring out what that employee's specific challenges are. Because the compact keyboard that worked for Sarah isn't going to work for Mary, for example, right? So, and the approach that I always take is very much a collaborative approach. I'm always, when I do an assessment, I'm always recommending based on need, not want. That is really important, because sometimes people will come to you, and I know you know this. I know all of you have had these requests where I want that mouse because I saw so-and-so have it and they said that it's great, right? But it again becomes a bit of an education thing. Okay, well, that mouse worked great for that person, but let's figure out your challenges, because there might be a different solution that you need. That mouse may not solve all of the issues that you are having. Everybody's different. But again, I also try to work with solutions, again, kind of going back to that, placing the mouse on the left side, right? Like, again, I don't tell everybody that they should mouse on the left side. I think that it's great if you can, but there are some people that when you tell them that, they're just gonna, their eyes are gonna bug out, or they're gonna roll their eyes at you and just be like, nope, not happening. I am not moving my mouse to the left side. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. There's no way. That's so awkward. I can't do anything with my left hand. You name it, I've heard it. And so if that's the case, if they're really not even, if they're not willing to learn, I mean, we can try to encourage them to learn, but honestly, we need to look for some other alternatives and make sure that we do find a solution. There are lots of mouse options out there. There are lots of keyboard options out there. So we want to try to pick a solution that is going to work for that individual's challenges, as well as, what's the word I'm looking for here? Their willingness to learn, their flexibility, their, do you know what I mean in that sense? Like, we're trying to make sure that you're not going to say, well, you have to left-hand mouse and that's the only way there is to it. We want to make sure that we're looking for something that's going to work for them, so that they actually, the chances of them following those recommendations is higher. Okay, so that was it for my questions. This is a nice short webinar. I'm looking at the clock here. I think I've only talked for half an hour, so that's good. If you have any other questions, now is the time. Type them in and I will definitely address them. I have been recording this webinar, so I will make sure to post that. Again, for anybody who wants to re-listen to anything or share it with your colleagues, or if you've missed it, right? If you weren't able to attend today too, I like to record it for that reason. Based on last week too, let me remind you, again, we talked a lot today about doing assessments or providing education, and I really leads in nicely to what I was mentioning last week, is that we really do believe that education is that critical element in preventing discomfort, and sharing this information with your supervisors, your managers, your office staff, your colleagues is important. And so again, you can share the recording, and one of the offers that we have for the October webinar month was that was doing an education, so a free office ergonomics training session when you're doing those workstation reviews. And maybe for some of you, if you are the one who are doing the assessments and you are in tune with ergonomics, and that's great, this might be actually an interesting method for you to try. So when you do an ergonomics session, like training session, right, do it in a group session. It doesn't have to be a big group, right? It's probably better if it's a bit smaller anyways, so that you get some people feel more comfortable to ask questions. You can make it more workshop style, but go over how to adjust your computer workstation, and then make sure that everybody has a checklist or something that they can go back to their own workstation and try to make those adjustments themselves. And then that same day, if you go around and follow up with all the people that came to your training session, 15, 20 minutes maximum, it's kind of also why it's nice to keep your training session to a sort of small group. Then you go around and you just look at some of the outstanding things. Again, they're more likely to stick with what you have told them in the training session if you do a follow-up, right? So they become a little bit more accountable. They know that you're coming around. So we find that this style of training session It really works well, and it helps people to apply the principles. So if you've been looking for some ways to help your office staff, then this offer might be right up your alley. Again, we'll do that free training session. It's a value of almost $500. So we cover a pretty wide geographic range in Ontario. If you are interested at all, please let me know. Okay, so I am seeing some questions come in. Let me take some time to read them. Oh, great question. Okay, let me read this out for you guys. Are ergonomic self-assessments useful, and when should they be used or not used? Is there a benefit to using them? Okay, so an ergonomic self-assessment. So for example, this could be like, I'm thinking it could be the online education, so going through a little PowerPoint. Could it be, reading a little pamphlet on how to adjust your workstation? I definitely think that those can be beneficial. Again, if you are the person at your workplace who is responsible for doing office ergonomics, you can spend a lot of time and you can get really tied up with all of the calls that you get saying, oh, I need an office assessment, I need an assessment of my workstation, and getting out there and finding out that you're just showing somebody how to adjust their chair. Right? And maybe that's all that they needed. So one of those self-assessment, a checklist, a PowerPoint, whatever it is, I think that they can be good because they can help to address some of those really easy concerns. And I say the easy ones like how to adjust your chair, right? If you've got a standardized chair or a couple different models of chairs in your workplace, then maybe in part of your self-assessment could be some links to YouTube videos from the chair manufacturer on how to adjust their chair. There are tons of little YouTube links out there now. And so it could help to save you some time, right? If somebody can do adjustments to their own workstation, then it is freeing you up for you to deal with some of the more complex cases. What I do find though is that if you are only relying on those self-assessment checklists, you want to make sure that there's some kind of a follow-up. So people are doing them and then it's kind of like, well, how do you know that they have done it properly? Or what do you do for the people who are still having issues? You just want to have that follow-up process. And maybe once in a while you do a different type of training. Again, if you have a lot of office workers and you're just relying on self-assessments, if you have no injuries and no problems, then maybe it's working for you, but it might be good on an annual or once every 2 years type of thing to do more of an in-person workshop. Change up the way that you're delivering that information to them. Presenting it in a new way can make it a little bit more engaging, can make it a little more stimulating. It could be like, oh, because some people just read it. It doesn't necessarily stick with them. So yes, I do think they have their place, and I'm definitely not opposed to them. But again, I just, you always want to just make sure that are they working the way that you want them to work? So that's the big thing. Okay, let me check if there's any other questions. Okay, sorry, I'm just reading this one, so it's a little bit longer. Okay, so curious about experience with doing assessments with the manager there. So okay, what is my preferred method for doing an assessment in terms of who is there with the employee, in terms of interfacing with that employee? And I definitely, let's see, my answer for this. So let me read out this question again. So curious about your experience with doing assessments with the manager there, either required on your report or if they want to be there. What is your preferred method, or does it depend on the culture of the company? Okay, great. So it definitely depends on the company. I think really is the short answer, and it also depends on the person. So in an ideal world, I like to do an assessment one-on-one with the employee without other people around. I find that I tend to get more candid responses, and sometimes, not always, like it's actually pretty rare, but sometimes there are some issues with the manager. So let's say, for example, the employee is, maybe they're excited that you're coming to do an assessment for them because maybe they've been complaining or they've been bringing up an issue for a long time and they felt like their manager hadn't really done anything, and so now they're like, oh, finally, and so they may not be as open in talking about some of their challenges if they don't want their manager to hear. Now, I don't know, that might be more applicable to me as a consultant because I'm a third party. So it's potential that they might share some information with me that they don't necessarily want their manager to hear, or that they're not comfortable. Like, I don't need to know necessarily specific medical diagnoses, and I don't report that in my reports. So again, I sometimes just find that people will be a little bit more candid and we can kind of work through some solutions when I'm one-on-one. That being said, though, there are lots of times when the manager might want to be present or the supervisor just because they're curious about what I'm doing, and that's okay too. At the very least, when I do an assessment, I try to follow up with the manager before I leave, right? Just say, okay, you know, the assessment went well. These are some of the questions. And again, if the employee has told me anything in confidence, I adhere to my kind of confidentiality agreements, my code of ethics. So again, in my reports, I don't talk about all the diagnosis and word for word everything the employee said. I'm talking about the overall discomfort and my recommendations. So short answer is that it depends, and it also depends on the issue. Great. Okay. Thank you everybody so much for attending. I know, I don't usually do a follow-up like this, but I can, if any of you know me, you know I like to talk. And so an hour last week just wasn't enough to kind of cover all the questions. And I really wanted to make sure that I gave an answer to a lot of the questions that came in. So I hope that I did address most of the questions that came in. If you think that I missed something or you think of something afterwards, you can always shoot me an email. I'm pretty quick at responding, and I do like to share my experience when it comes to office ergonomics and ergonomic assessments in general. So don't be shy. You can get a hold of me. The general email is info@proergonomics.ca, but if you wanted to contact me directly, I think most of you have my email from my webinar follow-up, but it's ssnabel, so my first initial last name @proergonomics.ca. Great. Hope you all have a great day. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you at another webinar. Bye.